So today, we're going to dive into a fundamental law of human psychology. And I mean, this is an idea so powerful it explains, well, pretty much everything, from crazy market bubbles to the intense political divisions we see everywhere. It's called the law of primacy, and trust me, understanding it might just change how you see the world. Let's get into it. Okay, so our story starts back in the late 1990s with this really strange phenomenon that honestly baffled a lot of people, the Beanie Baby craze. Right? These little floppy, understuffed plush toys went from being simple collectibles to something people thought was a whole new kind of investment.
And this frenzy, it reached absolutely incredible heights. There was one family who, believing they were securing their kids' future, poured over $100,000 into their collection. I mean, they weren't just buying toys, they were investing their entire financial hope in them.
Well, when the bubble inevitably burst, families were left just financially and emotionally devastated. So what drove them to this point? It turns out this modern craze is a perfect, if super painful, example of a psychological principle that we've known about for thousands of years.
And that brings us right to the core concept here, the law of primacy. We're going to look at it not as some old religious rule, but as a kind of user manual for the mind, a really profound insight into how we're all wired. Now, if you strip away the ancient language of this command, you're left with a pretty blunt psychological claim. This isn't really being presented as a threat, but more like a simple statement of fact about our mental operating system. And here it is, the law of primacy. The idea is that we are by our very nature worshiping creatures. And look, when we say worship, we're talking in a psychological sense. It's about what you orient your entire life around. Something will always sit at the top of your mental hierarchy, and it organizes everything you think, everything you feel, and everything you do. We are all wired for worship.
Okay, so how does this actually work in our brains? I mean, how does this one single ultimate concern become so powerful that it literally shapes the world we see?
Well, think about it. Your brain is just bombarded with information every single second. To make any sense of it, you have to filter it. And what determines that filter? Your goals and your values. This process creates what's called a cognitive value hierarchy. Basically, a pyramid of what matters most to you. And whatever you place at the very, very top of that pyramid, that's your God. And it dictates everything else.
So here's the crucial point. Whatever you value most acts like a cognitive North Star. And this is an automatic, pre-rational process. It's not something you consciously decide to do. It just happens. It dictates what your brain pays attention to and what it totally ignores. It literally changes your perception of reality.
Now you might be thinking, look, I don't worship stone idols. Fair enough. But the source material here argues that we have our own modern and maybe even more insidious gods. So let's take a look at the pantheon of modernity.
First up is the God of the marketplace. You know this one. This is consumerism, the belief that our ultimate purpose is the pursuit of material wealth and just buying stuff. And the allure is so powerful, right? This God makes some really big promises that you'll find fulfillment by buying things, that your identity is defined by the brands you wear, and that real true security can be found in your bank account. But here's the catch. That promise of lasting happiness, it comes at a pretty steep psychological cost. We get trapped on what's called the hedonic treadmill. You know, the thrill of a new purchase fades really fast, leaving us needing the next, bigger thing. This leads to consumer burnout, an endless cycle of desire and disappointment that just leaves us feeling empty.
Okay, the next modern idol is maybe the most voracious one in our current climate. The God of the tribe. This is what happens when a political ideology becomes our ultimate concern.
And you can see why this is so appealing, right? In a society that feels like it's fragmenting, political tribes offer a clear identity, a sense of moral certainty, a shared story, and, maybe most importantly, a common enemy to unite against. It gives us a place to belong.
But that promise of community comes with a really dark side. Psychologists call it identity fusion, where the line between you and the group starts to blur. This leads to cognitive inflexibility, and in its darkest form, the dehumanization of opponents. They're no longer just people with different ideas, they're enemies that have to be defeated.
And this brings us to our third and maybe the most seductive modern idol of all, the self. This is when our own happiness, our feelings, and our personal freedom become the absolute center of the universe. The promise is ultimate freedom and control. But this chase for radical individualism comes at a huge psychological cost. A fragile ego, one that's hypersensitive to criticism, and this deep, nagging feeling of emptiness.
It turns out a life focused only on the self is a very small and very lonely life.
This quote just brilliantly illustrates the problem. The Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl, he observed that true meaning, it doesn't come from focusing on ourselves. It happens as a byproduct of dedicating ourselves to something bigger. Real meaning is found in self-transcendence, not self-obsession.
So all of this leads us to a powerful and, frankly, a deeply personal conclusion. The choice isn't if we worship, it's what we worship.
The author David Foster Wallace put it perfectly. This isn't a religious question, it's a human one. We all build our lives around something. We all have a God. The only choice we get is what that God is going to be.
And Wallace gave a pretty stark warning about this. He said if you worship money, you'll never feel like you have enough. If you worship beauty, you'll always feel ugly as you get older. If you worship power, you'll always feel weak and afraid. These finite things, they're cruel masters. They will inevitably fail you and, in his words, they will eat you alive.
So how do you find your actual functional God? Not the one you say you worship, but the one you actually do. Well, this is a pretty good diagnostic tool. Where does your mind automatically go when it's idle? Where do your bank statements and your calendar show your real priorities are? And what is the one thing you feel you absolutely could not live without? The answer to these questions, that reveals your true ultimate concern.
And that leaves us with this final, really provocative question. Because whatever you place on that throne, whether you do it consciously or not, that will be your God. And that God is going to shape everything about your life. So choose wisely.